Franz Joseph Haydn doesn't need any introduction simply because he is the father of everything. He wrote 104 symphonies, incredible composer, the father of the string quartet. Oftentimes I would say possibly even the father of the piano trio, even though a lot of it was piano concertos with string accompaniment.
And I mean, Beethoven called him Papa Haydn, so
Exactly.
he was almost the father of Beethoven.
Well, and Mozart studied with him, Beethoven knew him a little bit,
Right.
and of course Schubert, which we'll talk about later. One of the things that you should keep in mind when we talk about this particular quartet that's coming up, the Rider Quartet, is where was Haydn born? So Haydn was born on the border of Austria and Hungary, right? And so he was one of those people where there's a lot of Germanic influence, but there's always that influence of Hungarian rhythms and folk melodies, which I think in some ways you remember them after you hear the quartet. So he was an incredible life force, and certainly for us, the quartets that he left us with basically enabled the idea of the 16 Beethoven quartets. Without Haydn, there would be no Beethoven quartets, at least in the style that we know them.
Yeah. And he spent all those years with the Esterházy family, at Esterházy, which is essentially a Hungarian count, where he spent much of his career building his chops and having all these wonderful musicians that were already paid for to write this amazing music for.
And speaking of being paid for, he, like just about every composer, and I think Mozart maybe is the best of them, he was always working for somebody. And it's funny because students always say, well, would he have not written these quartets if he didn't have a check? And the answer is, we don't know. Maybe he would have, or maybe he wouldn't have, but it was Anton Apagny who decided that he wanted some quartets. And we also have to remember, what did they do when they were done with work in the 18th century? They would read music. They would have chamber music. In fact, this chamber music concert is probably the single biggest room, unless you were a king or a count or something like that, that would be available to the Hungarians and the Austrians and the Germans. So thanks to him, we have this quartet. There's a lot of counterpoint in this quartet, and we will talk about it later. But in our first examples, I think of this as a very positive opening. Haydn is, well, I don't want to say he's as sunny as Mozart when things are going well, but he's certainly one of the most positive, do-gooders out there. In fact, the slow introduction was kind of invented by Haydn, and there's a great story by Beethoven saying that, well, why do I need to take the time with, somebody settling into their seat and relaxing? I just get on with it, But that was probably not the way Haydn would take it. So if we can listen to the first example, Sonata Allegro form, maybe we can talk about what is Sonata Allegro form, to give us some more ideas.
You want to say something now? Sure.
Yes,
okay.
Would you mind?
So yeah, this is something we've talked about before up here, the idea that the music is organized in such a way that most listeners of the time would have felt like it was logical for a certain theme to appear at a certain time. And I mean, we could go on for hours talking just about sonata form, but with Haydn in particular, I find it very interesting because he didn't always do exactly what was predictable. Some of his sonata form movements, he had the same theme, we call it monothematic, and others, like in this one, we have a theme and then we have a second theme, and then it appears like there's a third theme that pops up. That will be a little bit later in the piece.
But I do think it's really important to remember as you're listening to this, so if you have something in a key, then you have the second theme in a relative minor. It gives us a certain sense of balance, which they would have recognized as listeners. And maybe it's not a question of music theory as opposed to a comfort level when you're reading this or when you're listening to it. Yeah. So let's listen to the first example, please, John. So as you can see, this is an example of where all of the instruments play the same music. So it's actually very vertical, and it's not maybe melodic as we would expect it. Now the second theme is quite different. So you mentioned monothematic, right? And it's in B flat major. And when it's a third theme, what do they expect from you? I mean, they probably expect some kind of variation or something else, but this is actually quite different, isn't it?
Well, yeah, and so there's this wonderful book by Charles Rosen, who is a pianist and scholar, and in this book called Sonata Forms, which, by the way, was misspelled by the person who was selling it to me, and it said Sonata Farms. I always thought that was funny.
Should ask for your money back.
Still on my book, it says Sonata Farms, but Anyway, so Charles Rosen talks about how Haydn would do surprising things with his themes, and I think this is one of those examples where he's already in this new key area, and so we're expecting it to be the next theme, but it's actually like the third theme that we're hearing.
Exactly, and in some ways that surprise was a signature of Haydn's career, because not only was he a great humorist, which we'll talk about later, but he also was very, maybe charismatic is not the word, but he was very comfortable in surprising his own audience and sometimes shocking it.
Yeah, and I actually also wanted to say, because you mentioned it earlier, how the music was not quite as melodic as maybe as I say Mozart's would have been. And I always find that Haydn, I used to wonder, how can I tell the difference between Mozart and Haydn? For Mozart, I always think he's such a melodist. And with Haydn, I always feel like he's got, it's kind of rhythmic, like a rhythmic drive behind it.
Exactly, a foundation to it. Next example, please.
That's actually pretty melodic, though.
Yeah, incredible. But the lilt is what makes it, I think. In some ways, I always think that these are incredibly difficult quartets to play technically, especially for the first violin. I've done it. That's why I don't do it anymore. And the Dover will be one of the great examples of it. But it's one of those things where it's supposed to be light and effortless, but believe me, putting it together is a problem. Next track we have is a development section in triplets, and it's much more daring harmonically speaking. You know, in some ways, when we study these works, it's really hard because there's a sense of predictability until there isn't. And you really have to understand the harmonic skeleton of this in order to interpret it properly.
But that's what's so exciting about any of this music that you're bringing here to us, is that the harmonic daring, it's not just something that may have surprised audiences, it's that the development section, for instance, here is the place where it's appropriate to diverge, to move away from the music that was presented to us earlier. That's what the point of the development is. So it's harmonically adventurous because that's the right place for it to happen.
Exactly, and also the very idea of the triplet is so versatile. In this case, it goes from something that has that lilt to a driving force. So let's listen to that next example, John. Yeah, and when you listen to it in the concert, it actually brings you back to the original key. So
yeah, that's right. In fact, there's a particular chord. Some of you may have heard of the German augmented sixth chord. Maybe some of you have not. The German augmented sixth is a chord that moves to the dominant, and it's very prevalent in classical music, certainly in romantic music, but I found upon listening to this piece a little more that Haydn uses it quite often, and we'll see that Schubert is going to use it a lot later.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. It's actually incredible. The harmonic motion that Schubert uses directly goes from this. It's really quite something. Slow movement. Interestingly enough, the slow movement is in E major, and it's a sunny key. It makes all of the instruments sound sort of effervescent. Here we have this little clip where the harmony is scattered throughout the piece, and it's a beautiful sort of an evolution of E major. It's interesting what we talked about keys just now, but you can stay in the same key and still make it really, really interesting, and the audience can follow it. Let's listen to that example, please. Yeah, so that evolution. So it sounds like he wants to start in minor, but then all of a sudden we find ourselves in G major.
Yeah.
And it's minuet. So if you think of Beethoven, obviously he walked away from it. He went to the scherzo, but this is still Papa Haydn. The minuet is obviously a dance, but these instruments are not here to dance. It's just in the style of the dance. And it's sort of ambiguous, right? So you have the G major tonic, and then it sort of moves around. And I wonder if maybe somebody, like when they would play this at their house, would have intonation issues with this because they would recognize the keys, but you're playing on gut strings, for example, and man, I can imagine some of this stuff, although we probably sweat it a lot more than they do because, everybody here is like, well, got to get it right, and for them maybe it was just reading a Haydn quartet. Let's hear that next cut, please. Yeah, so this is the minuet continues like this, and obviously minuet has its sister or brother, which is the trio, and traditionally played somewhat slower, and then you do the da capo, you come back to the minuet. So in this next one is in the key of G minor, and we often talk in terms of, maybe we can talk a little bit about Sturm und Drang only because this is a great example where it's not really stress, it's just a darker key.
Yeah, I mean, we're going to get more of the Sturm und Drang, I think, in the last movement. Absolutely. For sure. Yeah. But we expect the minuet and trio, there's a lot of threes that are happening in these moments. And I think we've talked about this up here before. Mm-hmm. It's the third movement, and they're both in a meter that uses a 3-beat. And both of the movements, the minuet and the trio, they're in 3, but also they form 3 parts because it's minuet, trio, and then the minuet again.
Right.
So I find that always just so fascinating.
It's so interesting also because he uses a lot of chromaticism here in order to move around the keys. So let's listen to that trio, please, the next track. So let's move also to the finale, which is in the sonata form that you had talked about in the beginning. This is where the writer is nicknamed because you get a lot of the kind of melodic and harmonic gestures that they would have recognized as horseback riding. And certainly the commissioner of this work was a rider himself, and I think it was probably very moving for him to know that this was being done this way. Interestingly, the horse's gallops are very virtuosic playing, and of course the first violin has to do all of that. I think that the Sturm und Drang that you talked about here is a kind of section that is difficult for them to execute if they were amateurs, but it's really fun for the audience to listen. It's exciting, and it denotes this kind of writing.
Yeah, and this whole idea of Sturm und Drang, which means basically storm and stress, is that there are surprises in the music, and there are things that are done often in the minor mode, mm-hmm. where it's a little darker. So you'll feel this kind of stormy, all of a sudden something happens, and I think you'll get this in the rhythm here as well.
Absolutely. And also we should draw your attention, I think this example doesn't have it, but the rests are just as important as the music because all of a sudden he stops and he makes you wait, you can't breathe, and then go to the next one. Let's get that next example, please. So, as I said, this is one thing that's he repeats it many times, but listen for the rests in this. It's very, very exciting. Okay, let's move on to Florence Price. Now, Florence Price is getting a lot of play lately, which is really great because we really have not had, there was almost a break between her popularity in the 50s, of the 1950s, and really now in the 2000s where her work has become very much on the stage, and her symphonic works, piano concertos are done all the time. Compositional style very similar to Dvorak, and we should remind the audience that Dvorak, when he lived in the States, in Iowa and in New York, was very much interested in African American spirituals. So you get that in the American Quartet, you get that in the Ninth Symphony, and her work pretty much is an homage to the heritage. And we should really remember that her music was premiered by the Chicago Symphony. And that's
the first time that an African American woman was having her music performed by a really major symphony orchestra.
Yeah, especially in Symphony Hall in Chicago, which is just such a great place to listen to music. So let's listen to that first track with the opening of this. Has some harmonic twists in it, but to me, the signature of Dvorak is ever present there. It's very similar. I think in a way, Dvorak would have been very flattered if someone said, "Hey, you know, this lady in America is emulating music," because I mean, he was one of those people who says, "Look, I do what I do," and then she, listening to it. By the way, she was not the only one. For example, Amy Beach was very much in love with the music of Brahms and Dvorak, so she was not the one. But Florence Price, her music is so Slavic in nature, even though, to the best of my knowledge, she never went to Bohemia.
I mean, no, she's very American, actually.
Absolutely. Let's hear that track number 8, please. The opening of the first movement.
By the way, I think it also just bears remembering what's going on in the musical world at this time when she's writing this piece, because we might say, yes, Dvorak, but she wasn't actually writing this at the time that Dvorak was writing. He was already gone.
Right.
This was like, Schoenberg and very dissonant music. Even Bartók, for some of us is going to sound very dissonant. This is a far removed from that kind of thing.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point. I mean, many times composers, Bach would be probably the best example, would be writing music that was not popular in their time, and oftentimes they would be viewed by people of their time as dinosaurs. But as you can hear, it's beautiful music. You write what you write when you want to write it. Second theme uses pizzicato accompaniment, and it's rather like a waltz. Let's hear that example, please. I love that slow introduction to the viola solo. And we should mention that Dvorak loved the viola, and we don't know that she wouldn't have loved the viola if she did not love Dvorak, but the truth is it does sound very much like an homage to Dvorak chamber music. So the next one is the slow movement, which has some harmonic shifts that are quite unexpected, I would say, right? And there's a lot of chromaticism here. But what's nice about this is that even though she moves around harmonies in an unexpected manner, they're not jarring. It's not the kind of thing that Stravinsky would do, for example.
Oh, no. It's, of course, again, far removed from Stravinsky, right, Bartók, any of the modernists. So she's using harmonies that audiences would have been fairly well attuned to. But upon listening to her music, I find that she moves more quickly to these more dissonant harmonies than Dvorak himself might have done. And here again in the excerpt we're about to hear from the slow movement, you might catch this harmony that moves what we would say chromatically. It's moving by half step. So it doesn't really fit the key, and it's not that dissonant to our ears, but it is still kind of interesting.
Absolutely. Let's hear that next example, John. Yeah, so it's almost a little modal, which is going to bring us to the finale. Right. So we talked about the chromaticism and moving between keys, and it's not usually very much a dolce playing. But here in the finale, you have a pizzicato accompaniment, which is overlaid with a modal melody. Now, modes are a little bit different, and we kind of don't have time to get into it right now, but suffice it to say that it's not major minor. It has some very different whole tone things going on, and sometimes augmented intervals. So let's hear the finale, opening with this pizzicato, please. So there's your augmented second, which at times is associated, with Arabic music, and sometimes is associated with African American spirituals.
It could be like there's a scale called the Gypsy scale that uses 2 of those augmented seconds, or just the harmonic minor scale. It's very modal.
Just to walk it back to Haydn, his audiences would have recognized it immediately and said, that's got to be Hungarian. Yeah. But as we go through time, it could be anything. It could be any kind of ethnic music. Yeah. All right, in the time we have left, let's talk about our big piece in this program, Death and the Maiden by Schubert. This was written in 1824. So for those of you who are historical buffs, Mr. Beethoven was still alive. In fact, he was going to be, probably had sketches already for the Ninth Symphony. And so in some ways, this quartet needs a little bit of introduction in that while Beethoven and Schubert knew each other, they were rather diametric opposites, at least to my mind. Beethoven, the architect, shaking his fist all the time, except for when he was, melodically interested. And then, of course, the great songwriter, Franz Schubert, where he was, first and foremost, he was known as a songwriter everywhere, in Vienna, and anywhere, they would first say, hey, Schubert's leader, of course. And his quartets, and as well as all of his chambers, really is about the melody. So this, the reason it's called Death and the Maiden is there's a poem, and we will read it for you. I'm actually really excited because I have a German speaker here, and I will not let you suffer with my German. It would never happen. So therefore, you're doing it.
I'll take it on.
But not just yet.
Okay.
So let's look at the first movement where this excerpt is right after the opening of it. So I kind of wanted to do that because I want you to hear the opening for the first time with the Dover Quartet. There's such an impact to that opening. It really shouldn't be heard in any way other than live. But there's a lot of counterpoint and a lot of polyphony here. So let's listen to the first example, John.
So, I mean, there's so much one can say about this, but to keep it short, the idea is that it's a very Beethoven-esque thing to do, what Schubert is doing. And I should say it's Schubert-esque because he does it in his songs, too. The idea that you take something very small, this da-da-da-da-dun, and you turn that into that musical motive into an entire movement or sometimes an entire 40-minute piece. It's the very essence of all of the music.
What are the 4 most famous pieces of notes in the classical repertoire?
We should have them sing it.
You guys should do it, yeah. Ta-ta-da-dam, right? This is exactly what Schubert uses. Now, it'd be really interesting, a psychological study whether Schubert knew it or not. But the bottom line is, ta-ta-da-dam has already been written. Yeah. And he says, ta-ta-da-dam-dam-da. So I think the impact of this, while they're both in a minor key, and it's a very dramatic piece, is very, very different because this ta-da-da-dam moves it forward, whereas Beethoven's fifth is in place. It's really an incredibly powerful first movement, and it also is very difficult to play because of the ensemble and the way you put this thing together. So in the stormy middle section, in our next example, you have a 16th note triplet rhythm over the triplets. And again, I think this quartet in some ways is probably the most dense of all of the Schubert quartets because so much is going on all of the time because of the content of the poem that we're going to read to you in just a moment. It's a really powerful, stormy section. Let's hear that next example, please.
And if I could use the word sequence, this is something that composers, for centuries had been using, a way of ratcheting up the tension in the music. So when you're hearing this bum ba dum bum ba dum bum ba dum bum ba dum, he just keeps going with that, but moving it to a new area. It's a way of developing and really of bringing the tension in the music to us.
Yeah, I also want to draw the audience's attention to the bottom, to the 16th note. Daga, 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 daga. That's the engine that moves that whole thing around. What's incredible is that for a songwriter, you would expect it to be melody and accompaniment. So, for example, how would this sound if the piano were playing 16th notes? It would be quite pleasant, even in G minor. But when the cello does it and then the viola picks it up, you have this incredible textural power which transforms the entire melody. Really, really exciting. We're going to go to the slow movement. And the slow movement is really, it's all about deaths, and there's a series of 5 variations. But we do need to hear, I think, the opening of it, because there have been dissertations written on it, and some people think it's a funeral march, and some think it's a soliloquy. What's important is the economy of notes. So to me, that's a very Beethovenian gesture. He doesn't use a very large range, and he doesn't use too many notes. It's kind of pure and to the center of the heart. So let's listen to that opening of the slow movement.
And is this the right time to talk about
this
this
is the time we're
song?
going to read
Okay.
our poem. I just want to say one thing before you read that, and that is, it's so interesting the way performances, this is a performance of the Amadeus Quartet, so this is like now late 70s. But you hear from the 30s and 40s, like Budapest Quartet, and everything is slow. It's just funereal. And then as you get through the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and now, you end up hearing faster tempi in general, even though I buy it both ways, but it's just really interesting. All right, so this is our English translation, but I invite you to listen to Meyn with his perfect German.
Thank you. So first you'll hear the maiden, and then you'll hear death replying. Vorüber, ach vorüber, geh wilder Knochenmann, ich bin noch jung, geh lieber und rühre mich nicht an. Und rühre mich nicht an. Gib deine Hand, du schön und zart gebild. Bin Freund und komme nicht zu strafen. Sei gutes Muts, ich bin nicht wild, sollst sanft in meinen Armen schlafen.
Bravo.
Thank you. But
That was not easy.
I find this poetry, as short as it is, to be incredibly moving, because what we're hearing, and you'll hear this in the music, is first the slow music, that's the maiden, and then we hear the fast music, and it's death. And so it's this real, 2 worlds meeting each other.
Exactly.
And it's just so emotional.
What I was thinking about when you were reading, there's a Lieder, there's Das Erlkönig, where you have the maiden, it's actually a child, and the Forest King. So there's many, many times that he sets this kind of poetry to music, and it's always incredibly powerful and moving music. All right, the next example is much more agitated, and we should really kind of look at how drama is treated by Schubert as opposed to with Beethoven.
But can I correct myself first, though? I meant to say that it is death's quiet theme. That's the quiet one. It's the maiden who is agitated, and that makes more sense anyway.
Well, I think they both do, but as you said, I always think of like the funeral march, for example, in the Eroica Symphony, right? So it's layered, whereas here it's just kind of in place because Schubert, at heart, is still going to be a songwriter. So why don't we take a look at this next example that is much more excited and it's dramatic, and I think in some ways this is the closest thing that Schubert would write to Beethoven's ability to build tension and build drama. Next example, please. That last example of the first violin being way on top was something that Beethoven would never do. I mean, he starts out vertical, and he would stay the architect. But here's Schubert saying, hey, I'm still a songwriter. Don't forget to buy my songs. Do all of that stuff. All right, next track is another variation to the slow theme. And it's a D minor scherzo, right? And the dotted rhythms are actually, they're associated with writing, like in the Rider Quartet, and it feels like it's moving towards the drama within the drama. Scherzo, you should remember, of course, is technically it's a joke, but much like in Brahms' scherzos, this is not a funny scherzo. This is all
I always
about
think
death.
of the scherzo not as being just joke, but
Not
maybe
at all.
more intensity.
Oh yeah, for sure, and the trio is, of course, much more lyrical. But let's hear that next example. So again, it's in G minor, da, ba, bum, and it's one of those things where I think when we hear it now, it's actually a little bit less dramatic than it must have been in Schubert's time, because the kind of leaps you have between the E string, say on the first violin, and the G string, and the lowest strings on the violoncello, it's really would have jarred the audience then, and said, how do you get there, for example? You can't connect.
You were talking earlier when we were talking about the octaves, the use of the octaves on the strings.
Yeah, well, the thing is that with gut strings, it's very difficult to stay in tune, especially on the upper string. So I think that for him, much like Beethoven, it didn't matter the physical limitations of the then setup. He composed the way he wanted to. So next example is the dotted rhythm that we just heard is actually changed, and it's more pervasive in this movement. It twists around and evolves itself. Let's hear that next example, number 17, please. Yeah. Just from a technical standpoint of view, this is supposed to feel very Mendelssohnian, sort of effortless. And I could tell you, it's incredibly complicated to have two instruments play the same rhythm with the tessitura really close to each other and just make it sound like one. It's an incredible piece of writing and really exciting.
And compositionally, I mean, if you know the Earl King, that rhythm and that just pervasive bump-a-dum-pa-dum, never stopping, feels very much like Earl King. You almost feel like you're on a horse. It's like the writer again.
Right. In some ways, this movement, with its dark finale, is not the positive finale that Haydn would have written. And even early Beethoven, this is a dark work. I think it's an incredibly dramatic work. And we certainly have the very best four people to do it. So I hope you enjoy the concert. I hope you enjoyed this little bit of information, and thank you, Till, for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.